Arlington looks like just another DC suburb until you check the numbers. While cities across America fight over zoning and watch housing costs spiral, this Virginia county quietly became the nation's most aggressive housing builder. In the last decade, Arlington added more housing units per capita than almost anywhere else in the country. Rents stabilized while neighbors saw theirs double. The metro became a moneymaker instead of a money pit. And now, Washington, D.C. itself is copying the playbook. So how did a conservative suburb become America's urbanist experiment? And why is everyone suddenly paying attention to what happened here? The answer rewrites everything you think you know about American housing policy. And it starts with a decision most places were too afraid to make. In 1999, Arlington faced a crisis that would have paralyzed most communities. Federal highway planners wanted to widen Interstate 66 through the heart of Arlington's densest neighborhoods. The project promised faster commutes for drivers passing through. But it threatened to gut the walkable, transit-focused corridors the county had carefully built. Arlington's response was not typical suburban caution. County board members, planners, and residents formed a unified front. They argued that widening highways through urban areas was economic suicide. Instead, they pushed for the Rosslyn-Ballston Corridor Plan. They made a radical commitment to concentrate growth along the metro line. The logic was bold. Density was the strategy. If you build dense housing, offices, and retail within walking distance of metro stations, people do not need cars. The plan called for buildings up to 10 stories near stations, tapering down as you moved away. Parking minimums, the hidden villain of American urbanism, were slashed or eliminated entirely near transit. By 2004, the transformation was visible. Rosslyn saw residential buildings rise between office blocks. Clarendon, a sleepy strip of car dealerships, became a thriving neighborhood of apartments and restaurants. Ballston followed, then Virginia Square. Each metro stop became a node of density, designed for people, not cars. Between 2000 and 2010, Arlington's population grew by nearly 20%, but vehicle miles traveled barely budged. More people, the same number of cars. For urban planners, it was proof of concept. For developers, it was a gold mine. For residents, it was a model of how growth could actually improve quality of life. If you are finding this breakdown of Arlington's housing transformation valuable, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss our next deep dive into the cities that are actually solving America's housing crisis. Most American suburbs face a predictable cycle. Housing prices rise, longtime residents panic, and local governments tighten zoning rules. The result is stagnation and soaring costs. Arlington broke that cycle. In the 2010s, as cities like San Francisco and Seattle saw explosive housing demand collide with entrenched homeowner opposition, Arlington kept approving projects. While other jurisdictions debated whether to allow duplexes, Arlington was approving 20-story residential towers. The key was the Affordable Housing Investment Fund. It launched in 2008. Developers who wanted to build market-rate housing had to contribute to a fund that financed below-market units. By 2020, Arlington had preserved or created 8,600 affordable units, more than many entire cities. The policy worked because it was predictable. Developers knew the rules, planners knew the goals, and residents saw the benefits. New buildings meant new restaurants, better transit service, and parks funded by developer contributions. A planning commissioner recalls, "We had debates. People worried about traffic, about shadows, about character. But we had data. We could show that density near metro reduced car trips, that new housing stabilized prices, that growth was funding the infrastructure everyone wanted." Arlington's rents stayed nearly flat between 2010 and 2020. Meanwhile, nearby Fairfax County, which resisted similar upzoning, saw rents climb by over 30%. The lesson was clear. Building works. Arlington's metro stations were always more than transit stops. They were anchors of an economic strategy that turned public investment into private development. Take Ballston. In the 1970s, it was a car-oriented strip. By 2015, it was a dense, walkable neighborhood with millions of square feet of office space, thousands of apartments, and a public plaza. The transformation happened because Arlington's zoning code made it easy to build near transit. Amazon's decision to locate HQ2 in Arlington was the culmination of decades of this strategy. The company did not choose Arlington for tax breaks. Amazon chose Arlington because it had the housing, the transit, and the walkable neighborhoods that its employees wanted. Internal documents cited proximity to metro, availability of housing, and quality of life as top factors. The announcement triggered billions in private investment. But instead of panicking about displacement, Arlington doubled down. The county updated plans to require even more affordable housing, funded new bus lines, and invested in pedestrian infrastructure. The metro was thriving in Arlington. Ridership consistently outpaced projections, and farebox revenue covered operating costs. This was a rarity in American transit. The reason was simple. Arlington had built the land use that made transit work. Everywhere else was still building for cars and wondering why the trains were empty. For decades, Washington, D.C. and Arlington existed as two different worlds. Washington, D.C. had the monuments and the political power. Arlington had the planning discipline and the housing supply. By the late 2010s, Washington, D.C. started to notice it was losing. Young professionals were moving to Arlington, not because they loved Virginia, but because they could actually afford to live there. In 2021, Washington, D.C.'s leaders made a quiet shift. The city's comprehensive plan was updated to embrace modest density near metro stations, allowing duplexes and small apartment buildings in areas previously reserved for detached homes. Washington, D.C. was copying Arlington's homework. The political fight was predictable. Established homeowners organized against the changes. But a new coalition of younger residents and urbanist activists pushed back, pointing to Arlington as proof that density did not mean chaos. Studies showed that Washington, D.C.'s restrictive zoning was the primary driver of its housing affordability crisis. Meanwhile, Arlington's approach had produced stable prices and thriving neighborhoods. By 2023, Washington, D.C. had approved several large mixed-use projects near metro stations, following Arlington's playbook. The irony was not lost on urbanists. For years, Washington, D.C. had been the center of national policy debates, while Arlington quietly implemented the policies that worked. Now the capital was learning from its suburb. Arlington's success rested on a principle most American cities reject. You cannot preserve neighborhood character by freezing it in time. The county's neighborhood conservation program gave residents a voice in planning decisions, but it was structured to encourage evolution, not obstruction. Neighborhood groups could advocate for parks and sidewalks, but they could not veto housing. A longtime resident put it this way: "We were part of the conversation, but we were not handed a veto pen." The county made it clear that growth was happening, and our job was to shape it, not stop it. When Arlington promised that new development would fund better parks, it followed through. Arlington's story is not a fairy tale. Affordable housing remains scarce for the lowest income residents. Displacement still happens. Critics argue that Arlington's model is exclusionary by design. Even with affordable housing mandates, the county remains one of the wealthiest in the nation. The density is real, but it's luxury density. A housing advocate puts it bluntly. Arlington built a lot of housing, and that's great, but it built for people making six figures. Yet even critics acknowledge that Arlington's approach is better than the alternative. Doing nothing leads to disasters unfolding in cities across the country. Homelessness, sprawl, and economic segregation are the costs of inaction. Arlington chose to act. The rest of America is watching. Cities from Austin to Minneapolis are studying Arlington's reforms. State legislatures in California, Oregon, and Massachusetts have passed laws forcing suburbs to allow more housing, explicitly citing models like Arlington. For decades, local control was treated as sacred in American land use, but the housing crisis has changed the calculus. Arlington did not need to be forced. It chose density, and it reaped the rewards. Arlington's lesson is that half measures do not work. You cannot upzone near transit and still require 2 parking spaces per unit. The policies work as a system, not as isolated reforms. Some places will get it right. Others will fumble and retreat. But the direction is set. The era of single-family zoning as the default American landscape is ending. And Arlington, the quiet suburb that spent 40 years doing the hard work, is the blueprint. To help us keep the videos coming your way, please like and subscribe.